Hello and welcome to the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to talk about world building. Now, I know we talked before about place and how to put together place and put together notes and so on. What I wanted to talk more about is how to use place in your writing or how to incorporate it. So basically, there's two big messages here, and one is use all your senses. So consider the smell and the taste and everything of your world, and to weave it into everything you write. So let's begin by looking at what is world building. World building involves describing the setting of your story to the extent that the reader is transported into the world in which your story takes place. So whether your story takes place in the 20s and you want the reader to experience the 20s, whether it has to do with living in the Amazon jungle and you want the person to experience that, you transport them to this place. Some of my favorite books, things like Shogun by Clavel, where he transported the person to medieval Japan, was incredible. So some books are really strong on world building and taking you there. A lot of science fiction has to do with world building. So we're going to talk about some rules here for world building, or how to make it a very powerful component of your writing. So first, let's look at advice for successful world building. Here's 5 points, and the more that I showed writing examples for these 5 points, the more I recognized that they're all kind of intertwined and all talking about the same thing. First, use all 5 of your senses to describe the world in each scene. Talk about the taste of the place. Talk about the sounds. Talk about the sights. What does it smell like? What are all of these things that are going on in the world? Number 2, rather than having huge blocks of world description, weave your world into every scene you write. This is just like character description. You don't want just a big block. Oh, well, the character, went through high school. It all began in a tar paper shack, whatever. You don't want to do that with a character. You don't want to do that with a world either. You want the world to slowly unfold, even if you're on a completely different world. Don't tell people that. Let them find out. Let them discover there's 2 moons and realize, hey, they're not on Earth anymore. Number 3 is the classic show, don't tell. We already talked about that, and we're going to talk about it a lot when it comes to world building, because you don't want to tell people what's going on in the world. You want to show them through what's happening in your story. And include hundreds of fine details. Really, the devil is in the detail when it comes to world building. If you can define what the coinage is, what the taxi rates are, what all of the basic things that make up your world, in fact, everything, then you've got a full world that you can really immerse people in. And be aware of the when and where your story is set. This is that avoid anachronisms. So you don't want to have a Sony wristwatch or something in the 1920s or things like that you want to avoid. If you're in South America in the deepest, darkest jungle, then you're writing a different story than if you're in New York. So be aware of where you are at all times as you're writing. Now, let's take a look at this first point in more detail. And that is, use all 5 of your sentences. Make copious notes about the world and weave this information into every scene. For instance, is your world cold? Does it stink? Is it crowded and dirty? Loud or quiet? Is the emperor emblazoned on the local coinage? Is the local brew bitter or sweet? These are all things that can build your world. So get down to the details. Really take notes and define what your world is like. And guess what? You'll discover more things that you want to add that you didn't even realize about your world as you write. I find that. So don't worry about being too complete in your world building. The world will come to you as you write. Once you're there, you have to be there before you can bring your reader there. So let's look at some examples of using all 5 of your senses. Consider I walked with Pedro down the street. Well, it's a fairly serviceable sentence, and it tells you what happens. But consider this. I trotted beside Pedro, trying to keep up with his lengthy stride, slipping on the cobblestones slick with a stinking grime that made it difficult to weave through a crowd so boisterous that I could barely hear my guide's words. Listen to all of the description of the world going on in there. This is a grimy cobblestone street. Pedro has a long stride, and it's difficult to keep up with him. He must be a tall man, maybe. And the crowd is so boisterous or so loud. It's loud, so loud that you can't really hear what Pedro is saying about where they're going. Which sentence do you think makes a better description of the world? I think the sentence one, or the second one. You could complain that it's a run-on or something, or you don't like my writing style, it's too long, you'd break it up. But it provides a lot more detail about the world, and it uses all of the senses. It talks about sounds and feelings and so on. Next is weaving details into every scene. So here are some details. Consider this. Jacob drew back the bowstring. Though his fingers were so cold, he had difficulty handling the weapon. I don't have to say it's cold. Well, I am saying it's cold, but I can say it in an interesting way. I can weave it into the story. So now the reader knows that it's cold. The twin moons of Caspia and Narcissus cast dual shadows across the courtyard as Laudia approached. There we go. This world has two moons, and they're casting shadows, and Laudia's coming. So that's kind of an interesting detail to put in for world building. A tear formed in one emerald eye before running down her snow-white cheek. You can even do character building as part of your world here. Describe everything. Now, there is a point at which you can get to too much detail. They don't need to know every nuance, but pieces of detail that explain the character and immerse you in the world and advance the story are important things to have. You'll get good at recognizing needless detail and interesting detail the more that you write this way. Now, number 3 is show, don't tell, right? Consider Frank was fat. Right? That's another serviceable sentence. Consider this. Frank strained to take just one more step, anxious to rest himself. Should he find a large enough chair in the room on the second floor? So here's Frank going up the stairs. You don't say Frank is fat anywhere in this sentence, but you imply it. You give information about what Frank is doing, and you weave it into the story. So show that Frank is fat. Don't say that Frank is fat. Next, weave hundreds of fine details into the story. Consider this. The boy fingered the last remaining coin in his pocket. He's broke. Easily recognizing by touch alone the bust of the late Emperor Leto emblazoned on one side and the eagle of the empire on the other. So here he's part of the empire, and you've established some history for the empire. The Emperor Leto was one of the previous emperors who has passed. How about the Earl had a birthmark in the shape of a parrot on his backside? An adornment that made him hesitant to expose his body even before the whores on Parlance Lane. Oh my, that's a racy one. But we've established that the Earl has an interesting birthmark, and that he's a little shy about being naked, and where the red light district is in town. Remember this one? Give me a vodka martini. Shaken, not stirred. This is from James Bond. Remember, he always had his vodka martinis shaken, not stirred. That's a detail about this character that builds the world. Now, finally, I want you to remain aware of the when. For instance, is the 1920s or 2150, and the where, New York City or the jungles of Amazon, that your story is taking place. Avoid any anachronisms or anything that would jolt the reader out of your world. You want them to be there and feel comfortable and learn something about your world, by the way. So what these all seem to come down to is weave your world into your writing. Constantly be aware of it. Constantly be putting details of the world into the things that you're saying in your writing. And You will be world building. In the next section, we're going to talk about writing conflict and fight scenes. I'll see you there.